Good morning, YouTube. Sunday, cold and grey outside. There's going to be some pretty interesting deconstruction of the budget and a discussion of its relation to federalism. So I'll have a go at recording that before the outsiders commence.
The budget has shifted the federal-state game, but to what end? There's been a lot to talk about in the wash-up from this week's first Abbott budget. But once the to and fro over cuts and the trimmings dies down, the lasting conversation is likely to be over one of the budget's almost surprising, perhaps far-reaching aspects. And that's the budget's implied changes to Australia's federal compact and the kickstart that it's given to the conversation on changes to tax, especially the GST. Now today, premiers and chief ministers are meeting quite hot under the collar to consider their response, where they go next. The federal government has pulled big chunks of money out of schools and hospitals and responded to the stunned outrage of the states with little more than a shrug. The federal-state game has changed. But how? And what is this new direction for Australian federalism? Are the states ready to accept what looks like an almost exclusive responsibility for key deliveries in health and education? And how will they pay for that? That's a pretty fundamental conversation in Australian politics. And if nothing else, it's probably fair to say that its terms have just changed, and quite significantly. Joining me to chew over the detail and look at where this discussion might head are three people with a keen interest in federal-state relations. AJ Brown is Professor of Public Law at Griffith University. Carmen Lawrence is a former West Australian Premier, a former Labor Minister, Federal Labor Minister too, and is now Winthrop Professor at the School of Psychology at the University of Western Australia. And Patrick Gallagher is from the Department of Accounting and Corporate Governance at Macquarie University. Welcome to you all. Professor Brown, can I start with you? Just walk us through what the government has proposed in schools and hospital funding, this much discussed $80 billion cut.
Well, I think despite you describing it as stunned outrage, Jonathan, I think there's an element of this which is not actually that much of a surprise because of the fact that, A, we knew that the government was already considering that some of these levels of funding were unsustainable, but B, because everybody has known for a long time that the sort of garbled mixture of shared roles and responsibilities, if not confused roles and responsibilities in funding for those types of areas has been a problem that's been getting worse and worse in the system for quite some time, and that this would be something that would have to get sorted out, especially in a context where not just the federal government, but the state governments themselves, especially the conservative ones, have been contracting their spend and restructuring their spend anyway. So I think this is going to be, this does confirm that the government has meant some of what it said and some of what was really inevitable at some point or other, and that there's not going to be any room now for prolonging that confusion, if possibly we can start to do something about it.
And we're talking about money that, let's what's a word for it, was perhaps hypothecated, shall we say, by the previous government over the sort of the out years and the longer period in federal estimates.
That's right. There's a bit of a difference between some of the rhetoric we've been hearing and some of the reality of what's in the budget, I think. And some of that's been fed by the National Commission of Audit and its support for the idea, sort of a fairly black and white, oversimplistic picture really of ideas about how the Commonwealth might just simply be able to retreat from all these areas totally, which it's not going to be able to do, and that somehow this would lead to some sort of new age of competitive federalism which would solve all its own problems, which is simply not going to happen. So we live in reality that I guess the confirmation of this budget is we now have to deal with that reality.
Carmen Lawrence, that notion of retreat, I mean, what do we take from the body language of the federal government this week? I mean, Joe Hockey has just sort of shrugged and says, well, that's their problem. is that the way to start a constructive conversation around the relative responsibilities here?
Far from it, and I think the premiers have good reason to be very upset. I disagree that this is something they could have anticipated, because particularly in Abbott's case, he'd made it very clear that he thought that the Commonwealth, if anything, should have a greater role in some of these areas. In fact, at one stage recommended taking over hospitals entirely at the Commonwealth level. And he has said in other places that any withdrawal of involvement in spending in these areas would rightly be seen, as he says, as a cop-out. And they've just recently met and set out a process, an orderly process for examining questions of revenue and some of the arrangements related to the NDIS and Gonski and so on, which is the only way to do it ultimately. If it's a unilateral decision by the government, in this case the federal government, with all the funds, and it's clearly indicated that not only will some of what they did suggest they would do in relation, for instance, to Gonski funding, but also a whole range of other additional withdrawals, that's going to cause a great deal of antipathy from the state premiers, no matter what their political complexion. Because, as we know, the states have got a lot of responsibilities and very little revenue with which to do it.
It's a big change, though, isn't it, in the nature of the discussion, as you suggest there, with the Prime Minister's sort of changing view on this. I mean, how would you characterise the way in which the discussion has been framed over the past decade or so, and what difference are we now starting to sense?
Well, I think a lot of people could see the shift, particularly toward Commonwealth control, as perhaps inevitable, and that eventually the states might well wither and die on the vine, and of course the states resisted that. What we've seen now, I guess, is a complete about-face, which says no, we're going to have a strong division of responsibility, reverting to an age that we haven't seen really for the last 30, 40 years, but the money's not going to follow. You'll have to find your own sources of funds, and I think that's the real shock. But also the Commonwealth clearly seems to be reserving for itself, in a sense, the opportunity to interfere when it feels like it. It tells the states they're running the schools, but it keeps all the independent schools and insists that only chaplains can be employed for the funds that are available for counselling purposes, for example. And in the case of hospital funding, that they will give some level of indexation, but not one which had formally been agreed by the states, where they take some responsibility for the increases that result from changes in technology and so-called betterment factors. So it's a mishmash. It's not even a clear statement, I think, of what they believe to be the Commonwealth's responsibility.
Is that the problem, AJ Brown, that it is rather confused? I mean, as you pointed out, we had that mentioned in the Commission of Audit of perhaps returning some tax functions to the states, but we've not really been engaged in this discussion before that point, and suddenly we have quite a dramatic shift in that conversation.
Well, Carmen Lawrence is quite right about the mishmash, because exactly that point about it is pretty inconsistent to see within the same budget that the government says that it's withdrawing from schools, that it's refunding or continuing to fund the constitutionally questionable National School Chaplaincy Program. I mean, so this is where the challenge now falls on the federal government to get on with that process of saying, and we're going to sort out roles and responsibilities better, and revenue will have to still be part of the discussion about that. But the big question is, can all parties get on and maintain that commitment to, or build that commitment to a process for sorting out more sensible roles and responsibilities, and B, can they then lock it in so that it will stand the test of time and not just retreat to that sort of ad hockery and interference that Carmen Lawrence is quite rightly referring to. And then there's other challenges as well that go with this, which is that whereas some states like Western Australia or South Australia or even Tasmania actually really do have their community's support for running state and regional level programs, other states like Queensland and New South Wales simply don't have that level of community support. That's where the base support is for people who do think that the states should be abolished. So there are these fundamental tensions, and unless they're taken into account in the way that the conversation now happens, then we have to be worried that we're just going to go through not just a repeat of previous cycles of talking about improving the system through this type of federalism or that type of federalism, but actually having gone backwards quite a significant step.
And Patrick Gallagher, given that the conversation sort of ignores a lot of those complexities, are we right to think that it's simply the federal government trying to start a conversation about tax through the proxy of the states?
It's a very interesting question. The number of issues that arose in the budget which have not really yet been understood are quite dramatic. If I just pick one small issue, there's the question of whether the GST would have a broader base or not. Interestingly, if you look at the $5 charge that applies to a person going to an ordinary medical practitioner now, and the way that works is there's a $5 lower return in terms of Medicare rebate. If you take the average visit to a medical practitioner as being about $60, what the federal government has effectively achieved is approximating 1/11 of $60, which of course is 10% on $53, $54, which gives you an effective equivalence of GST on medicine. So we see a tendency towards the government moving to new tax bases. And this does seem to be an encouragement towards a broader recognition of revenue collection. The dilemma we've got with doing things like this is it creates enormous complexity. The minute we start introducing a number of small charges and taxes, each one of these inevitably is inefficient. And so we're seeing a growing complexity, and it's able to be considered against what happened in the mid-1990s. In the mid-1990s, the government created additional complexity with sales tax because they were needing funds in a hurry. That was finally resolved in the late 1990s with the introduction of GST. The trouble is GST is not growing as fast as other revenues, and it's small compared with other countries. Consequently, in the context of GST, we're seeing a push towards a federalism and a debate in this area.
But Carmen Lawrence, if we're having a conversation more broadly about responsibility, where's the federal responsibility to lead that discussion on tax, on revenue?
Well, we're not getting it. I mean, the Commonwealth collects the GST, whatever it might say about the states needing to make the argument. Ultimately, it has to go through the Commonwealth Parliament. So it needs to be a national conversation. And it would also need to be in the context of what are other taxes that might achieve the same outcome. I haven't had a recent look at the regressive effects of the GST, but, you know, in most cases it's generally seen that income tax is a preferable means if you're looking at equity. Consumption taxes may be somewhat easier to collect because there's less avoidance, although that's, I guess, arguable in some cases. So
presumably if it was to broaden into areas that are currently untouched, I mean, those become increasingly regressive, things like food, for example.
Well, and education and health and so on. So we really have to have a look at who pays and who pays most as a society if we are really interested in outcomes that are fair and equitable and may result in some level of redistribution. That should be part of the discussion. Not having the state scrambling because they're going to be in a position of really not having the revenue to fund their hospitals and schools properly into the future. In fact, one of the things I think that's likely to come out of this, because these cuts aren't going to be felt immediately, but rather when some of the existing agreements finish, is that they'll be seen as someone else's problem. In the case of Western Australia, I don't think Colin Barnett's going to be around when this hits home. So he's quite prepared, I think, to extend the debate and have a discussion about the share of GST and probably even to drag his heels because it's not going to be his problem. It's probably not going to be Tony Abbott's problem either, the way he's going. But these are out into the out years. So in a sense, there is a chance to have a discussion, but it's a very bad way to start it. I think it just breeds ill will.
And that's a point, isn't it, AJ Brown? I mean, the willingness to participate in this discussion now will depend very much on where people are in the electoral cycle. I mean, and that in itself is something of a recipe for delay and inertia around this, isn't it?
Well, it easily can be, and it does with the number of Conservative state governments that are now heading for the polls soon. I think that's part of why we may be seeing such a rapid decision to have a good meeting on today to try and start sorting this out. It does mean that there is quite a potential here because there is a critical mass of Conservative state governments as well as a Conservative federal government. It does mean that there is some scope, although those states will still fight tooth and nail in many ways as if it was an opposite political persuasion. The fact is that we tried a whole new species of making federalism work while we had wall-to-wall Labor governments, recently and very historically, and a certain amount was achieved, but we really proved that that's not enough. So the this really does, this historical period really does put the pressure on the Liberal and National parties to show that they can get their act together on a new formula that will serve the community, because state governments fundamentally serve the community, not just the economy, and try and do something which is capable of sticking for the long term. And this is a big challenge, but it's a challenge which is so long overdue that I think everybody knows this really is the time to bite the bullet and see whether we can't make a difference.
Is that right, Carmen Lawrence, that it's entirely overdue? And I guess if it is, why don't we have that collective sense that it's a discussion that needs to be had? Why are we being dragooned almost into this conversation?
I think because it's been cast too narrowly, instead of really having a look at, well, what are the responsibilities, what should be the responsibilities of the Commonwealth and the states in the 21st century? Is the model of federalism we have really fit for purpose today? As we've heard, some people think that state government should be abolished altogether. Is that really a better form of government? I mean, to go back to first principles. And I know a lot of people want to avoid that because it seems we've had that conversation before, but each new generation, in a sense, has to re-examine those questions. And then what flows from that are questions about where the funds will come from, how they will be distributed, whether indeed we continue to embrace the principle that whether you're a citizen of a remote area in the Northern Territory or of a wealthy area in Sydney, you are entitled to similar consideration and services. That these are important underpinning principles that should be examined as well, because we're falling short on almost every front at the moment. So you get petty debates at the margin when some of the fundamentals remain unexamined. And
I guess the risk, Patrick Gallagher, is that in this particular context, that a lot of those bigger picture issues will be lost in a fairly niggly conversation around tax.
Yeah, the trouble is that the federal government collects the tax, gives it to the state governments, and there are two ways the tax gets given. One is via the GST, which is given all to the states, then there are other payments on top. There are changes in the amount that's given to each state based upon their own ability to generate revenue. So Carmen Lawrence would be well aware of the fact that the average West Australian taxpayer, 44 or 45% of their GST payments actually return to Western Australia, whereas most of the other states, it's around about, well, sorry, I should say most of the other states, most of the other states that are larger states, Queensland, Victoria, New South Wales, are around about equal. But when you get to Tasmania and the Northern Territory, Tasmania is getting around about $3.50 per person, Western Australia about $1 per person, Northern Territory about $11 per person. These kinds of debates mean that the states and territories are fighting with each other, which means that if you reduce it all to simply the question of money, there are going to always be a variety of tensions. The issue becomes, where do you start? And I actually think that the starting point has to be a more consistent form of revenue that's available to the states, so that the states are able to budget in a sensible way. And I think the whole concept that you start saying hospitals can charge $7 per person if they choose to is entirely the wrong way to go about this. The debate about the GST rate has to be central to it all. And I agree fully with Carmen Lawrence that the debate about making it non-regressive for the poorer people in society, or the lower economic status, whatever term we wish to use that makes it understandable for the listener, they need to be looked after. And I'm not sure that the current federal government is showing fully that it understands that.
AJ Brown, as we say, we have this meeting today. Where is this going to head as a concept of our federalism? We've had for years this notion of cooperative federalism. We've had introduced the idea of a sort of a competitive federalism. Is there something in the middle?
Well, I think inevitably there has to be, but what we do know is that they're going to have to remain a very strong core of cooperation and collaboration to making the federal system work. There will remain coercive elements. And I mean, I'm a big fan of diversity and difference within the federal system, which is where the competitive element comes in. Let different levels of government and different governments innovate and then be rewarded for that wherever possible. And so I think it will continue to be a mixture of all those different types of federalism, but it really requires a new culture of thinking about clarity, certainty, confidence in the community that we know what we're doing, and when we decide to do something, doing it rationally and then locking it in so that it's transparent and sustainable over time. And those are the things that we haven't done. We've had too much of the rhetoric where we're doing this time it's cooperative federalism, this time it's competitive, and in fact, underneath it, really fundamentals don't change in terms of the dynamics of the relations between the parts of our federal system. That's the cycle that we really need to break.
Yes. Well, look, one thing is for certain, it's a conversation that's off and running. The Premier's meeting today, the federal government planning a white paper on federalism, so there's more conversation on this, clearly something of a priority. My thanks to former WA Premier, former Federal Minister, Carmen Lawrence, AJ Brown, Professor of Public Policy and Law in the Centre for Governance and Public Policy, Griffith University, and Patrick Gallagher from the Department of Accounting and Corporate Governance at Macquarie University. It's 26 and a half minutes after 9 o'clock. You're listening to Sunday Extra here on RN. Jonathan Green with you, and up next, a budget antidote.
Okay. Well, that was interesting. He's going to have his budget policy antidote, and I get a little bit of time to set up before First Dog on the Moon follows The Outsiders. Wobbles on a lot to YouTube. Ciao.